Se inicia sesión.
Buenas tardes con todos. Es un gusto darles la
Good
bienvenida.
afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone. I'm Carla Sáenz, Regional Director of Bioethics of the Pan American Health Organization. Before we begin our session, I'd like to let you know that we have interpretation into English and Spanish.
To the session in English. Los demás que quieren escuchar en la sesión en español no van
For
a tener.
those who wish to listen to Spanish, you won't have to worry about the interpretation channel because the panelists will all be speaking in Spanish today. As I said earlier, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'd like to let you know that we have been extremely successful with the registration for this session, to the point that we've had to change the room because there were many more interested in registering for this course than what we had originally planned for in the usual room. This is the first session of our regional bilingual workshop on agreements on the transfer of materials and agreements on the transfer of data. As I said, I'm very pleased to welcome you. I'm Carla Sáenz. I'm the Regional Director of the Bioethics Program of the Department of Evidence and Intelligence for Action in Health at the Pan American Health Organization. This first session will be part of 4 sessions where we will begin from the most general and move on to the more specific topics. We will begin by talking by the agreements, the basic concepts of these agreements. Then we will talk about what it means to use these agreements in practice. Then we'll talk about the roles, the responsibilities, and challenges in using these agreements. And then we'll talk about regulations and the regulatory aspect of these agreements, which represents a challenge for our region because in general, these regulations are yet to be written. Let me remind you that we will begin by talking about the material and data transfer agreements, mainly basing ourselves on the International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research Involving Humans. These are the guidelines of CIOMS of 2016. And as you know, they were co-published by Pan American Health Organization in Spanish. Guideline 11 and Guideline 12 are the ones that mention these agreements. Guideline 11 specifically focuses on the collection, storage, and use of biological materials and related data. And Guideline 12 is sort of a mirror of 11, but instead of covering materials, it covers data specifically, which may not be associated with biological materials. This is a quote from Guideline 11 that we have discussed very often. The transfer of human biological material must take place through an agreement on material transfer. This agreement should serve to document biological materials in such a way that they can be recovered. Also, they should specify the variety and duration of the use and what must occur at the end of the period of use. All responsibilities pertaining to these material transfer agreement must be specified clearly in a document. There is also a need for an agreement on the transfer of materials for multinational research projects where a body takes the samples of a person in all the participating countries and stores them in one single biobank. That is the basic text that led to so much discussion on this type of agreement. And if you will recall, these conversations usually occur when an emergency happens, and internationally they became particularly prominent when the Ebola outbreak took place, where a lot of transfers were sent from Africa to other countries in the region. Specifically in the context of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, at PAHO we have begun to discuss this again, and to catalyze ethical research in emergencies and ethical guidelines, lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. In that, we have a chapter 6 on future research, how samples and data can be ethically shared for future research. And in that chapter, we mention the importance of using these kinds of agreements, realizing that they are new to a region. That's why, under the section of recommendations in the document, we mention that training on these material and data transfer agreements will be a part of our pending regional agenda. And that is the reason why we have organized this webinar today. Here I share with you the website of the Regional Bioethics Program, where you can join our listserv, ethical research, and then receive all materials, all the resources that we have available, and which we can send you. And then you have the QR code for the web page of that publication. Not only will you see the full publication there in the 4 languages, but you will also see the executive summary in the 4 languages and the specific recommendations for the health authorities and ethical research committees in both languages. Also in there, we have included a series of slides which you download and use at work or in your classrooms or with your committees, whatever setting you find appropriate, where you would like to introduce the content of this Pan American Health Organization publication. So without any further ado, I'd now like to share, well, before introducing our expert for today, I would like to express thanks to all of those who have participated in the preparation of this workshop, particularly Sara Caracedo of PAHO and Sofia Salas of ODD, who's also a panelist and whom I will also introduce later on. So to start, it's a pleasure to have with us Dr. Pilar Nicolas. She is an attorney, and she's the coordinator of the Inter-University Chair of Human Genomics at the University of Vasco, and she is a researcher on excellence of the Basque Council on Social and Legal Sciences applied to new technologies. She has participated in many national and international research projects at different universities and is a member of 2 research ethics committees, the one from her university, as well as the Ethics Research Committee of the Carlos III Health Institute. Pilar, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Carla. I would like to begin by expressing my very sincere thanks and appreciation for this opportunity you have given me to participate in this event that has been so successful. I hope I don't let you down. I'd like to expressly express Sara Caracedo, Sofia Salas, and Carla Sáenz for their organization of this event. And I am thrilled to be here with colleagues and friends from many beloved Latin American countries that I can see on the chat who have been sending me greetings. I've had many academic relationships with many of them, and I've visited you, and I'm very aware of the high academic level of your work in the area of bioethics. which which is so fascinating. It's a challenge for me, therefore, to have this responsibility today of in beginning this discussion. I will begin by sharing my presentation. Can you see it now? Yes, we see it perfectly. Thank you. So I will begin. I'd like to refer to three main points, and I may speak about things that will be discussed later on, but I would like to focus my presentation from the perspective of the European experience, and more specifically from the Spanish perspective. So I thought it'd be interesting to share with you some very concrete issues instead of just general topics based on our own experience. So I hope that even though I may be speaking in advance of topics you'll talk about later on, I wanted to give our own perspective. Let me begin by some initial comments on the circulation of biologic and data samples for purposes of research, biomedical research. And I'd like to address this from a perspective that explains why it is necessary to share data and samples, and that explains also how we have dealt with the scientific challenge from the perspective of Spain and Europe. In Europe, we have a regulation, a data protection regulation, which is the same in all member countries of the European Union. It's a regulation that applies directly to all states and entered force in 2018. And it pays very particular attention, much more detailed than the preceding regulations, on scientific research data and materials. The perspective adopted is a positive one. In other words, the rules on data protection must guarantee the rights, ensure the rights of the subjects. That's the first part of the regulation. It's the basis, it's the grounds for the rule, but it cannot serve as an obstacle to prevent science advancing. And the advancement of science today would be impossible to achieve unless we use information. And the more information we use, the more solid the results, because they will based on a larger population group. We will have a knowledge and know-how of greater value, and in the end, we will be able to improve the quality of life of many people and the efficiency of the healthcare services. That is why we want to make sure that the data can be used for scientific purposes, of course, guaranteeing the rights of the subject. And if we want to use a large volume of data, you have to facilitate the circulation of the data. Another thing that happens in scientific research, and this is a reality, very often large economic investment, human investment is made, both public and private, and therefore the results have to be shared. That is, again, part of the ethics of research and of the legal obligations. The EU now has a regulation in for the protection of health data, where we want to encourage a data lake. In other words, a forum for shared data, so that all the results of research can be shared and be made accessible. This, legally speaking, is an aspiration, and in some cases is an obligation. We have, on the one hand, from bioethics and bio law, because my perspective is legal, we have the obligation of guaranteeing the rights of the subject, but we also have the obligation to take advantage, to benefit from the results of the research and share it. That is the focus of our legislation. This regulation that I just showed you, I just showed you the introductory part, the preambular part of this regulation, refers to information, to data that has already been obtained from a person, the personal data of that person. But we, in these agreements that we're talking about, are referring to the circulation of the information, but also the circulation of biological materials, which, if it until it's analyzed, it's not information. It's only support to information. In Europe, we don't have very detailed legislation on how you circulate biological material for research purposes. We do have it in other areas. For instance, if it's done for purposes of a transplant or transfer in a human being, for that there's very specific legislation. But when you circulate samples for in vitro fertilization, for instance, the European rules are more generic. We have the Oviedo Convention that mentions it's very general. And then there's some recommendations made by the Council of Europe. There are also some guidelines that go beyond the European ones. There are also policies adopted by centers. But generally speaking, what we have are state rules and regulations. The rules that are legally binding and applied in a more evident manner. That's why I'm going to be referring to both things. It's true that a biological sample is a means of supporting information, but it's more than that. It's a part of one's body, it's a physical material, and the conditions for the circulation of it are not identical, nor do they have the same regulations applying to it. That's what I'm going to refer to. This doesn't mean that in one single agreement, we cannot include all the conditions based on a sample. We could have one single agreement that encompasses all the requirements that cover both dimensions, samples and data. But you need to keep in mind that both regulations need to be included in that convention.
Here we have an example. There may be other possibilities, but this is just one example to show how to circulate data and specimens. Later on, we will see how this chart is filled out, but it has to be filled out with legal rules and obligations between the parties. But I can give you an example. I believe that this is a pretty normal or usual assumption to have this, circulation of specimens and data. A specimen or data provider may be a hospital. There could be others, of course. There could be, foundations like what we have in Spain. But let's focus on this example with a hospital where patients go and diagnostic testing is being done, and this can be used or to extract specimens for research. There are remaining matter left. Therefore, the hospital is a key source for data and specimens. The hospital maintains these data and specimens that have been obtained legitimately for diagnostic purposes in a clinical environment where the purpose is to provide individual benefit to the patient. But the hospital may, under certain conditions that we will review later, share these clinical data about these specimens that are clinical in nature with a secondary purpose. Now, in Spain and other countries, and I'm sure some countries in the region, some other countries in this region use this repository model where the hospital sends these data or specimens. This data / specimen repository, which we call a biobank, legally may be part of the hospital. That's one option, or it may be a standalone institution or agency, legally speaking. But in any case, from the organizational point of view, there is a difference between the primary clinical purpose and this secondary research purpose. Therefore, there is a transfer, a physical transfer first of the data and specimens, but at the very least, a transfer in purpose. In this transfer, this biobank or secondary agency must seek its own legitimacy and use their own guarantees. Now, if data and specimens are transferred anonymously with no traceability back to the subject, we have to make a difference first between anonymity and use of pseudonyms. But when we're talking about specimens and data, the regulation on data protection does not apply, because this regulation applies to personal information that may be directly or indirectly linked to a person. But we do have to apply the legislation on material transfer. For example, the terms, the biosecurity terms must be agreed upon. Now, when data are transferred under a pseudonym, because usually we do not transfer data with personal identifiable information, in Europe, we apply the regulations on data protection. The important thing is to be able to have traceability between the source, subject, and the repository where those data are kept. The rule is that unless it is absolutely necessary to transfer personal identifiable information, they must not be transferred. So the source keeps those data, but the biobank or repository may not be able to identify the subject. But if it becomes necessary to contact that source, a patient or participant, they could identify the person at the source, because at the source, you can crack the code, let's say, to be able to link the data to the subject, to the person. Then the third step is what makes this operation make sense. From this biobank or data repository, data are transferred to a third party, which will be the researcher that will use these for research purposes. In turn, this third party must also justify the legitimacy of its use and apply its own guarantees. Therefore, this is a new operation. This operation will be ruled by different requirements based on the type of transfer. For example, if the only thing that will be made available to the scientific community are anonymous data with effective guarantee of keeping them anonymous, for example, aggregate data or a catalog of data, in that case, we can think about completely open access. Now, on the contrary, when we transfer data that may violate people's rights because they may lead to identification, or maybe not necessarily identification, but somehow the person's rights may be violated, then it's different. For example, if this in this third stage, we may be able to identify information that would benefit the patient's health, and we have to trace it back to the patient to let them know. So we ensure confidentiality, but that does not mean that the participants or the patient's rights are not touched. There has to be controlled access to the data, which has to be included in a contract. This contract or agreement may be between the repository and the third party, or the repository may become a sort of middleman to send the provider send the contract to the provider for signature. That will depend on the models that are used. For example, under the biobank model that we have in Spain, the relationship with this third-party researcher is with the repository and the biobank. The agreement is signed with the biobank, but there are other data repository models where data are collected from a lot of hospitals or a lot of centers, where the repository becomes a communication channel, and it may even have an agreement model that will streamline data and materials transfer, but the agreement is signed with the initial provider. So all of this will depend on the way in which the repository is structured.
Un paso más.
So now we're going to take it a step further. This structure that I just described with an example will now be explained in how it happens in practice. Well, in practice, it's through transfer agreements. In these transfer agreements, we need to identify who's who, what roles and responsibilities they have. And then we run into some differences when we talk about biobanks or biological material repositories, or simply data repositories.
Repositorios de datos que, como digo, se están desarrollando.
There are data repositories that are becoming more and more evolved. And as an aside, let me tell you that we need to take into account that the genetic sequencing capabilities have evolved a lot. And honestly, we have complete sample genetic sequencing. So for the researcher may need to access the complete sequencing and not just the specimen. So, like I said, all of this is evolving very quickly towards the importance of sharing data. Because, like I said, we have already extracted a lot of information from the specimens themselves. So this is the end of my aside, and now I go back to describing the roles and identifying all the parties that are included in these operations. When we talk about biobanks, we're talking about the source, that is to say, where they come from. For example, with all the rights. For example, the right to do what they want with the material. In order to donate material, we always need to get consent, because donating material means to give up part of our body, because that belongs to us. There are certain exceptions, but this is the general rule. When we talk about data, at least under the Spanish rules, we're talking about the identifiable subject. So our rules cover other possibilities that include use of data that are different from consent. I mean, we can talk about this later during our discussion, but this is important difference between both systems. Now, when we talk about biobank, we mean we refer to the fact that specimens come from a center that are then transferred to a biobank. And when we talk about data repository, we're talking about a data provider that is a responsible party. That's the role. So the role of a party responsible for data is highly regulated in our rules, and their duties or roles and powers or responsibilities are very well spelled out. The party responsible for data must meet the first obligation, which is to vouch for the legitimacy of those data. And it is defined as the party that makes decisions on the purpose of treatment. So a hospital is responsible for medical charts or medical history because it is their part of their role to document that and decides how to use those medical charts. Let's take it a step further. When the specimens or data go from the center to the biobank or repository, we also use different language. We talk about a biobank. In Spain, biobanks are perfectly regulated in very specific rules. There's a national registry of biobanks, and by definition, the biobank's purpose is to foster scientific research and may use the specimens with any scientific purpose. And it is their obligation to share, it is a legal obligation of the biobank to share specimens.
Por el contrario, cuando hablamos de repositorios.
Now, on the other hand, when we talk about data repositories, we refer to an entity that handles data to share, and it may be a party responsible whether they have any kind of responsibility about the secondary role, or it may be a party providing a service to the initial responsible party to make in order for that party to use the data for a secondary purpose. Now, when a service is provided and they did not decide on the purpose of the treatment, that person is simply in charge of the data. Now, for these operations to circulate data and specimens, when we talk about a biobank, we're talking about a biobank ethics committee, which is an agency that's also perfectly well regulated. They need to review all the ethical aspects of research and handling. Now, when we talk about data repository, we talk about data access, which are not very well defined on our rules on data circulation. Now, there are certain bills of law in Europe to address the issue of data transfer. Finally, in this long chain, or in this loop, we have what the ultimate player, which is a researcher, because they need specimens and data in order to perform research. Now, when we talk about regulating biobanks, we talk about researchers. When we talk about regulation on data protection, we talk about a new responsible party. So this researcher, who's a user of the repository data, becomes the party responsible for this new treatment, and therefore must meet new obligations and issue new guarantees, as well as to justify. I'm sorry, there was somebody just turned the microphone on, so I don't know if that was a question or whether it was accidentally turned on. No, everything's perfect. Okay, let me move on then.
¿Qué tenemos efectivamente?
So now, what do we have as rules regulating this whole circulation of data and specimens? Like I said at the beginning, when we talk about biological specimens, Europe does not have a detailed legislation. Now, we do have mentioned in a recommendation, but again, this is a recommendation from the Committee of Ministers on the use of biological materials of human origin for research purposes. And it talks about the transporter flows of biological materials. This is what it says, that these flows shall take place through a documented agreement. So this is what we have internationally, but at the European level.
Voy a dar un paso a la normativa
So
española.
now I'm going to talk about the Spanish legislation. Here are state rules are the ones that provide this legal anchor. In Spain, we have a decree from 2011 where there's a reference to a more generic legislation. So in this decree from 2011, it talks about the biobanks. It explains how biobanks should work and how a biobank should share specimens, because like I said, this is what makes their purpose clear. Here it says that whenever a request is made to a biobank by a researcher, a transfer agreement document must be signed between the person responsible for research on the one hand and the biobank or the person responsible for collection on the other hand. And then it describes the basic aspects that this agreement should have.
Basically, the one receiving the agreement has to guarantee the proper use of the sample. That has to guarantee that what the biobank has done is fulfilled. The biobank stores samples for a very specific purpose, that is to benefit research, but always guaranteeing the rights of the subject. And this is what has to be included in that agreement. In general terms, it says here that the researcher, the person receiving the transfer, must ensure the traceability of the sample, show where it comes from, what biobank it comes, what kinds of operations are going to be done with the sample, what kind of information has been obtained from it. He has to trace, he has to know exactly where the samples are at every moment in time and what is being done with them. The researcher also has to guarantee the availability of genetic relevant information for the health of the subject, because we have recognized the right of obtaining results relevant to one's health. This, of course, also assumes that the sample has not been made anonymous, because if that is the case, then this right to give the information wouldn't make sense. If the sample leaves the biobank, not from a collection in a center without the unique formula of a biobank, then one has to observe the internal regulations for the operations of the biobank as applicable. For instance, for purpose of payment of fees or any other applicable situation that comes from the biobank's regulations. And finally, you have to ensure that when this project is completed, the end of the sample is guaranteed. Either it's destroyed or returned to the biobank. But the control of the sample has to go beyond the end of that project. What other aspect have we regulated in terms of the circulation of samples. For instance, in the transfer of samples from a biobank. We have established an agreement between what we refer to as the one responsible for the processing and treatment of the data, who decides on the finality of the data, and the concept of the person responsible for the treatment or processing, the one who provides that service. It could be that in circulating the data and the sample, there is someone who does not decide by themselves what is done to that data or samples. Instead, the decision-making power is retained in the hands of a preceding provider. For instance, they only provide services to storage information in the cloud, for instance, or maybe somebody who provides only sample sequencing information, and then the information is given back. Or they provide intermediation services, say intermediation between a hospital and a third party. So when one of these parties does not have the decision-making power, but instead provides a service to someone who is responsible, then we have a responsible and in charge kind of contract who is responsible for the information. So they don't have the obligation to inform the subject of the information, because the person in charge is like external person, but all the control is kept under his own responsibility. Therefore, we can say that the encargado, the person in charge, is an extension of the one who is responsible. And the difference, the definition has been very clearly laid out and detailed in this document that you can find online. It appears in several languages. It's printed by the European Provider on Data Protection on these concepts and on the relationship that exists between the one responsible and the one in charge. When this occurs, here we're going to find a similar situation to the preceding case. What you want to ensure through this contract, which is mandatory, as stated in Article 28 of the General Data Protection Regulations, is that the person receiving the data has to have complete control of them at all points of time, and that data should not leave the decision-making power of the person responsible. So the finality of the transfer has to be very clearly laid out, because the person in charge has to know exactly what he can or cannot do. You also have to describe the guarantees of safety and confidentiality. There may be persons who are sub in charge. In other words, the person receiving the data may have a service and asks other entities to support them. Those contracts are possible, but they have to be provided for. You also have to provide support to the person receiving the data so the person responsible can fulfill his obligations. For instance, if there's to be an audit, or if you need to determine the rights of the subject, or the impact the risk could have, or what will be the final destination of the data. As you can see, the spirit of the agreement is the same, but in this case, the content is regulated by a different rule, a rule that has a European scope and can coexist with the preceding contract. It coexists with regulations on circulation of samples. So we're now going to fill in the gaps in the initial scheme with more specific legal and concrete rules. The initial hospital will be the responsible party in terms of data processing, and it'll be responsible for the clinical charts, clinical history. When it grants those to a biobank, when it cedes it to transfers it to a biobank, if that biobank or repository is going to make its own decisions and assumes power full power of that data and samples, it becomes a new responsible party. It'll have to inform the subject of its existence. It is no longer an extension of the hospital. If all it does is serve as an intermediary and doesn't make any decisions on its own, then it becomes a body in charge. And when the samples leave the biobank to a third party, that third party then becomes a responsible party for the processing and assumes all the obligations of that role of responsible party. The contract can be signed according to the structure that has been adopted with another entity. What I want to make clear is that it's extremely important in the circulation of the data, and the transfer of the data, to have this very clear structure. It could be this one or another one, but it has to be very clear from the very beginning, because it is legally mandatory to identify the role of each in order to be able to identify what contracts are needed and who signs them. Now, this shouldn't be seen as an obstacle. In my experience, this forces you to think of many things which later become very useful and benefit the circulation and transfer of data and information. Very often a project, when it begins to build infrastructure, delays decision-making for several reasons. And the obligation to have this design, because this is an obligation that comes from the rules and regulations on biobanks and circulation of data, then also makes it mandatory to initiate this structure and to make decisions that facilitate the establishment of this structure. This is my view on this obligation to identify the flows very clearly as a legal obligation, and it should not be seen as an obstacle, rather as an incentive. Obviously, of course, we cannot deny that this imposes a significant decision-making burden, but it's a necessary one in order for the process to be a transparent process. And finally, in my last point, I've included examples of concrete agreements that are accessible on the internet, transfer agreements, and you can look at them by going to the Spanish Biobank platform and then looking for the agreements on transfers of samples, so that you can see how the conditions that I've described are specifically included in a contract and detailed. As you can see in this contract, we identify the parties. It presents the interest of each one of the parties in having this agreement, and then it explains what makes this agreement a legitimate one. It describes the purpose or the object of this contract, of why the material is being transferred. It then describes the obligations of the biobank as well as the obligations of the recipient, the receptor. The biobank's obligations includes accrediting that the authenticity of the material is legal, and as there's also a reference to the rules on data transfer. It includes the conditions provided in that rules on data protection in this agreement to transfer samples. So therefore, the biobank commits itself to stating that the origin of the samples is legal, licit, that to the quality of the samples and the data, and the facilitating the transfer, although there may be a cost in it, and then that once the material has been sent what are the obligations of the recipient. Basically, their obligation is to use the material exclusively for the purpose for which is specified, and must guarantee the traceability of the samples, and therefore cannot give the material to others, must guarantee the confidentiality and make the commitment when the samples and data have been sent in an anonymous or with a pseudonym, with a code that can identify the patient. It assumes responsibility for appropriate management and handling of the material. There are clauses on the on publications and the use in conferences and matters pertaining to intellectual property. There is a provision on the final purpose of the project and what will happen with the materials after the project is concluded. It covers economic matters on the transfer of the materials. It covers confidentiality throughout the entire process of the agreement, which now extends once the agreement is concluded. It has clauses pertaining to non-compliance with this commitment and on how the agreement will be terminated. And finally, there is the signature where you have the legal representatives of the two institutions, the researcher, biobank, and the researcher. To that, we are a series of annexes attached. For instance, one that gives a detailed description of the samples that will be sent. I'm going to give you another example because this is very useful and could serve as a model for the clauses pertaining to data. This code of conduct is a document which was adopted by the pharmaceutical industry in Spain and was approved by the Spanish Agency on Data Protection, which is the body responsible for supervising data protection in Spain. A code of conduct is a tool. It includes the rules and regulations for implementing the rules on data protection in a specific area of activity, so that the agents involved in that activity have a guideline that has been authorized by the Spanish Data Protection Agency, so that they know exactly what they have to do in order to comply with that standard or rule. This code appears online here. And in this code, there are many sample or models for contracts, for clauses that cover researchers. And there is a contract clause, for instance, that for somebody who's a promoter who is supporting a clinical trial, and a third who's providing the services to that promoter. Since I think you will have the recording and the slide available for your use, I will not go into details explaining these clauses, but I did want to give you a general description and insist on the content, the purpose of this content, which is what I've been saying. In other words, it guarantees that the recipient will carry out the indications and rules of the one sending them the data. In this case, it's a service provider who's not going to make a decision by themselves, but they will have to follow the indications of the body sending them the data. In this case, all they will be doing is, say, providing a coding service. It could be a different kind of service. It could be storage, for instance. And then with these examples, I have concluded my presentation. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. I'm concluding this, and I hope to hear comments of the other speakers, and then I hope we'll be able to discuss any matter that was not clear or where you still have some questions. So I will stop sharing my screen, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Pilar. The session has been very active, as you can see. I think you've raised a lot of interest, a lot of questions. And now we will have a panel discussion where the first person to participate will share some questions, comments, is our colleague Sofia Salas. She's an expert in research ethics from the Bioethics Centers of the University and Development School of Medicine of the Clínica Alemana in Chile. This is a collaborating center with PAHO and WHO for any work done in bioethics. Go ahead, Sofia. Thank you very much, Carla, for your introduction, and to Pilar for your excellent presentation. I will comment briefly. What Carla asked me to do is shed some light on the current situation in our region and specifically in Chile. And I will make 3 comments at different levels. First of all, we still see that some researchers as well as scientific committees do not have a clear understanding as to when they must request informed consent to collect leftover samples from a clinical context, something that's quite basic. So we need to create more of a culture of why that person who's donating their sample may want to accept or not accept that these be used for research purposes. There's a fear, there seems to be a fear to ask for informed consent because it could be either opt-in or opt-out. And although the requirement of informed consent should not serve as an obstacle for the advancement of science, on the other hand, the need to advance science should not step on the rights of those individuals who are providing the samples or data. The second level, at least the reality in Chile, is that 90% of clinical trials are financed by industry and always include the sending of samples and data abroad. This is informed in the informed consent document, but it's never explicitly clear what the destination of those samples will be, who are the persons that will be responsible for them, and in certain times it says, and the laboratory can transfer this to third parties in other countries. In my view, the ethics committees could request further clarification and specificity on that, particularly when there is the possibility of doing genetic studies. There needs to be specific informed consent for that purpose. At this level, we still need to know whether or not there will be a return of the results and whom those results will be given to, particularly when they have a clinical interest.
Just like we do with biobanks, like Pilar said. In my opinion, the transfer from the local center, which is normally a hospital or a lab, to the industry has to have a minimum agreement that must be overseen by the ethics committee. For example, this way we ensure that the person may have the right to withdraw from the study and request that their specimen be destroyed, or for what kind of research a new informed consent may be needed. Sometimes it's not very clear at this level. And then we have the third level, which is what Pilar talked about, that has to do with data and specimens that are transferred from one biobank to another. In our region, there are just a few countries that have specific rules and regulations for biobanks. For example, in Chile, we do not have that yet, but sometimes we've had to review these transfer agreements. And normally this is done by the ethics committee attorney, but normally the committee members do not have a clear idea of the specifications that Pilar mentioned in her presentation. And to conclude, I believe it's very important to say that we should, as a region, make sure that all countries have rules and regulations governing biobanks. That way, we can encourage and stimulate collaboration at the regional level. More often than not, our specimens end up being sent to countries in the northern hemisphere, and we do not have a lot of data and biological materials transfer here. So it will be useful to have similar agreements in a region, just like the European Union does. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Sofia. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Sergio Sequeira, who's also a close collaborator for PAHO's Regional Bioethics Program. He's an expert in research ethics, and he worked at the Pontifical University Catholic University in Brazil. He also is part of the ethics committee at PAHO. Go ahead, Sergio. Thank you very much, Carla and Dr. Nicolas, for your presentation. Now, I have maybe a question to Dr. Nicolas, which is, it refers to the concept, but it is very important for countries that are yet to develop their own national legal frameworks for biobanks, data repositories, etc. Now, in terms of difficulties in sharing data and specimens between countries, some authors have identified a lot of differences between the countries that do have regulatory frameworks, of course, in terms of the detail in their principles and rules, and also the number of rules that are considered necessary to protect the principle, and also in the way in which these rules and principles apply in any given situation. In some cases, the countries in our region have seen excessive regulations and excessive details in those rules. Just in general, in research ethics, not just when talking about the rules governing data transfer. Sometimes, and this is a very personal opinion, a lot of rules with a lot of details can end up impeding implementation in a specific context. And this is on a case-by-case basis. It also makes it very difficult to reach data transfer agreements because there are very specific and very unique data that are very hard to harmonize. On the other hand, on the other extreme, rules that are vague can also be used as a pretext to deny access to biological materials or data. This happened actually in Brazil once during our Zika epidemic. So, Dr. Nicolas, in your opinion, what is better? To have very objective and clear rules which could impede implementation in different contexts, or for the countries that want to develop their own regulatory framework should have more concept-based rules that can be interpreted in different ways, which may be unforeseeable. And wouldn't it be better to adopt the CEOPS ethical guidelines? I don't know what your take is on this, Dr. Nicolas. Thank you very much to both of you for your comments. No, I'm sorry. Not yet. I'm sorry. Let's finish this round of questions and comments, and then we give the floor. Now, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Pamela Zúñiga, who is part of the legal department at PAHO. She is also an observer at the Research Ethics Committee in PAHO. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Carla, and thank you, everyone. I am learning rather than helping Carla. Even though we address this legally, it's a constant learning experience because of all the legal implications these agreements have. Now, my question for Pilar, and by the way, I would like to thank you for this very thorough presentation and all the new concepts that you introduced. So my comment is along the lines of what Sergio says, and that is, how can we have transfer agreements between countries or organizations that have different legal frameworks? Like we've said, there are a lot of countries, especially in the region, where development of these legal frameworks is still in its initial stages. And on the other hand, we have other countries from which we normally get specimens have their detailed and well-developed regulatory framework. So my question for Pilar is, in your experience, what's better? From my point of view, or in practice rather, what we do, and this may be wrong, is that in order to reconcile between the legal framework of the sending party and the receiving party, and where the agreement cannot go just by one set of rules or the other, we go by general principles. And then both agencies, the provider and the receiving party, can meet these overall principles and ethics in order to use these specimens for research purposes. But in Pilar's opinion, how can we go about this issue that comes up regularly in our line of work? Okay, now, Pilar, the floor is yours. And to our participants, after Pilar's responses, we will be getting additional questions from you. So please make sure that you post in Q&A or raise your hand. Okay, so my worst fear has actually materialized, and the questions are very hard. No, not the questions, the answers rather. But this is a meeting of experts where, of course, we are going to hear the truly concerning aspects of our work. I think, well, this is not a professional answer, but we need to strike a balance between general rules in terms at the principle level and a very detailed set of rules and regulations that leaves no room for ethical aspects. So that balance between those two extremes should be stricken. And I'm going to give an example of how we do this in Spain that also will relate to international transfer, which is the other stool. For example, the other leg of the stool. For example, the regulations on biological material transfer point to two things. It says, first, that when the samples get to Spain from subjects in a different country for research in Spain, that is to say, when we import samples, we need to have some sort of provision that says that the specimen collection process met the same warranties as if the sample or the specimen had been taken in Spain. That is to say, does that mean that we have to follow the same legal rules? Well, no, we have to go by the rules of the source country. We talk about guarantees. So which are the guarantees that are applied in Spain for specimen handling? Well, the use of an accredited ethics committee. For example, in my experience, from the ethics committee point of view, when we receive specimens from other countries, we ask that an ethics committee from that country and an accredited ethics committee that is send a document that's, valid, official, with all the proper signatures, identifying the researcher, the project, etc., saying that they can affirm that the applicable principles that rule this process in the countries have been met. And we accept it and therefore authorize the use of those samples in Spain. Now, what happens when it's the other way around? So this example I just gave you shows flexibility. So we have the rule, and that's a clear criterion, but that criterion is saying that this agency, in this case, the ethics committee, make a decision based on reliance on this other ethics committee. So basically we are combining, legal with reliance and the ethical principles, etc. So this is the example of what we do with samples in Spain. What happens when we export specimens? That is to say, when biological material leaves Spain? Well, one radical legal principle that also relates to the first comments from Dr. Sofia says that no specimens may be exported unless they are to be used for a very specific research project, because the biobank project for, with wide uses is only for samples within or specimens within Spain. Now, when we export specimens under the regular conditions, we require that the people's rights are guaranteed, just like they are guaranteed in Spain, in general terms, of course. So the ethics committee is the party that needs to ensure through the agreement that these rights are respected. For example, to guarantee that specimens may be traceable, and if the subject revokes consent, that specimen will no longer be used, or the confidentiality agreement. So it doesn't refer specifically to the terms of that agreement, but rather there has to be a sort of international framework and say we have to pay more attention to ensure that this other country will have the same guarantees. The agreement has to be signed no matter what, regardless of whether the researcher is in Spain and the specimens come from Spain. That is a given. But this additional level of control that is because the specimen is going to be sent to another jurisdiction. So for this extra level of control, we need to look at the terms in the agreement and legal aspects and ethics committee. So we need to see whether the researcher is reliable, whether the research institution is reliable, the importance or significance of that investigate or research, and the necessity to have those samples used versus others. So there has to be some sort of leeway to make case-by-case decisions. Now, if we start talking about data transfer, this is far more complicated because the data transfer system that we have with the European regulation is very complicated. And it's the same for all countries. It hasn't been developed individually in each country. We have the European regulation, and that's it. It is highly complex. I am not able to give you all the particulars, but I could say that there are certain countries that have been rated as safe in Europe, and if the destination country is one of these safe countries, then the transfer happens just as if it was sent to a European country. As far as I remember, Argentina and Uruguay are considered safe countries. I mean, there may be others, but I can't remember. But it's not a very long list. Now there are systems protecting personal data transfer to countries outside the European Union. There has to be a contract with very specific provisions. There is actually a sample contract that we have to follow. And sometimes it's not easy for the receiving party to sign these contracts. For example, they have to give up their jurisdiction should a conflict arise. So international data transfer follows a very complex system with a lot of limitations. Now, we are awaiting a decision from the European Council on data protection for research purposes on the use of confidential data, and it will, we hope, address international transfers, and we'll see how that plays out in the sense that there's a lot of complex aspects involved. For example, transfer based on consent only may be very specific, very limited. It is considered an exception, so we have to legitimize the transfer, and it's not a simple process. Now, another thing would be to send anonymous data without identifying the subjects at all, but that's not very usual in research. So for that case, we can do the specimen transfer data, but all of the regulations for international personal data transfer would not apply. But again, this is a case-by-case, this is done on a case-by-case basis. We need to see what the research needs are, how identifiable data are, to see what system we need to implement. But in summary, my response would be that, like I said, we had to strike a balance between enough details to provide some sort of legal certainty, but it cannot become about meeting certain items on a checklist without assessing the case itself. Like I said, how important researcher is reliance on that researcher or research institution. And there is some leeway to do this because it's very important to have committees involved that will address legitimacy and will take all of these aspects into account.
In summary, the question of data leaving Europe is extremely complicated, particularly personal data. It's not impossible, but it is very complex. And we hope that the opinions of the European authorities on data protection will give us some guidelines on how to make the system more flexible. I don't know if I've answered these very difficult questions. Thank you so much, Pilar. I don't know if Sofia, Sergio, or Pamela have anything to add. Go ahead, Sergio. First, I'd like to begin thanking Dr. Pilar for her answer. I think that the summary is that the truth is halfway in between, as always. What concerns me a lot is that very often countries, because of their own idiosyncrasies or cultural characteristics, even ideological at times, create rules that are set in stone. And the problem with that is when a sanitary health emergency comes up, they need to change everything or violate their own rules, because the risk that if they don't do so, they will not be able to do any research, or they won't be able to share or collaborate with those abroad. So that's a comment I would like to make, because since many of the countries don't have a specific legal framework for this purpose to make sure that the laws are, or rules are sufficiently flexible so that you don't have to completely change them, or that it becomes impossible to make any transfers. You fall into the trap of doing something so tight, so specific, that then you can't do anything when a specific emergency situation arises. That's my comment. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. Very interesting thought. I completely agree with you. So, Sophia, I think this is an excellent opportunity for countries in the region to learn from those who have already worked a great deal in this and see how, as a minimum, we could come up with a structure, so to speak, where our countries would agree to have a common regulatory framework that would facilitate and serve as a, instead of serving as a barrier for the transfer of materials in our region. Thank you, colleagues. As you can see, there are a lot of questions. And I think that the discussion by our panelists have already addressed some of the questions that appear in the chat. In view of the fact that this is the first of 4 sessions where we're going to be discussing the basic concepts, what I'd like to do is ask some of the questions the audience has asked that have to do with the basic concepts which Dr. Nicolas has presented, and about which some of the participants would have her go into greater depth. One question has to do about the responsables, the responsible parties. Could you please explain a bit more who are the different responsible parties? And I realize that the difficulty in this discussion is that when you're talking about sharing samples is because the responsible parties are multiplied and vary and change, and that may be why people ask for more clarification on who these are, and include those cases in which we go from a small responsible biobank that can transfer their samples to a larger biobank. That's the first question. Maybe we should go step by step so as not to make it very confusing. Thank you. Thank you for that question. The thing is, there's no answer. I'm sorry. It all depends on how the structure is designed. The definition of responsible party is the one who makes a decision on the final end of the processing of the data or the samples. And so it can vary. If it's a small biobank and it transfers its samples to a large biobank to have that one handle them, and then the small biobank no longer makes a decision on the later use because it has transferred it, well, then it is no longer the responsible party. That initial small biobank is no longer the responsible party. However, if they choose a different model, say the small biobank associates with the larger bank in a federated network, then what the large biobank does is connect several biobanks and channel the requests through a platform and put third parties in contact with the initial smaller biobanks. Well, then the initial small biobank maintains its decision-making power over the data and samples, and it will be the one that makes the decision on the transfers or not. Maybe through the large biobank, but always giving the final decision power to the small biobank. So they have shared responsibility. So with this, I mean that we can't, from the outset, say this was the one responsible, this one is not, this is the person in charge. No, you have to first look at the structure, see how it functions, and then transfer that into legal terms. First, look and see what structure exists here. What structure do you want to build? And what decision-making power does each one of the stakeholders want? What is the function of each one? It's just a storage platform, say, that's what they say. Or they say, no, the hospital no longer makes a decision. It cedes power. You have to ask the role of each stakeholder and then develop the structure. And it has to be done that way, because I'm very familiar with many different models where the roles include, sometimes the hospital is responsible, sometimes it's not. The repository where the information is held is responsible, and sometimes it's not. You have to ask in each case, what function do you have, what decision-making power you have, and what are your obligations? Thank you. In terms of the structure of your response, it's a response that we're very used to in research investigation where rules fail, and that's why we have structures such as ethics committees that end up review and analyze specific cases. Another group of questions had to do with the scope or the application of the content of your presentation and the specific agreements. Do they apply also to samples obtained from the community or samples obtained from clinical scenarios? And this is in relation to obtaining the samples, but also in terms of the final use of the samples.
Lo que explica, ¿no? Marca su ámbito de aplicación.
What determines the scope of application is the storage and transfer and use of the sample. If the final purpose is scientific research, then this regulation applies, regardless of whether the origin of the sample is clinical and it's being used a clinical leftover for research purposes, or whether the sample was directly obtained from a person for the purposes of research, and that's its primary use. Or whether the sample comes from a cadaver. It's the same. What's important for the regulation is the final purpose of the storage, the processing, or the use. Thank you. I was remembering that in section 1 of chapter 6 of our document, how to undertake an ethical research during an emergency, in one of the graphs, we tried to capture what you're saying. That is, whether this sample is going to be used for research purposes or whether there's a route to follow if, for instance, it's a clinical leftover sample or original research or a public health surveillance purposes. Many of the questions in the chat have to do with a topic covered by the previous discussion we had with our panelists on whether there is or a model, a framework, a document from PAHO that could serve as a guideline for these contracts. And I think this is the work to be done still. And so I did want to make that clear that in generally speaking, we base ourselves on SIOM's international ethics standards, but I do think we might want to consider, and precisely that's what we're trying to do in other areas relating to clinical trials. We're thinking of proposing some sort of model with minimal content that would make it easier for those jurisdictions that are trying to move forward in this area can do so in a proper way and easily, and also to encourage harmonization, coordination between the different standards that exist in the region. Now, one of the questions asked by one of the participants is, if there exists an institution in a jurisdiction where there is no current rules for this purpose, what should they do? What are the tasks that need to be undertaken from the institutional perspective in a setting where the rules of the country have yet to be developed? Does the question refer to how you need to coordinate the rules, or what do you need to do to import export samples? No, just imagine you are the head of an institution in a country where there are no rules or regulations for this purpose. So what do you need to start doing at the institutional level? In addition to, of course, advocating or getting lobbying to get this rules to be adopted. But what the institution do to follow the highest standards if there is no adequate rules in existence? Internal policy. You can develop your own internal policies and protocols for that institution. For example, Dr. Science commented on this earlier. What happens with consent for the use of samples? Even if they are leftovers from a diagnosis and do not require any physical intervention, that person still has the right to control over that material. So even if there is no rule, that institution can establish a policy on the rules or regulations that will govern all diagnosis leftovers or that exist in that institution. So you could start by adopting internal policy. And then if you have your own ethics committee, there are many different models. In Spain, we have different models of ethics committees according to the province, but there is a model where the ethics committee belongs to an institution. For instance, a hospital has an ethics committee, and it'll take into account that protocol and then can help and should actually participate in the drafting of the protocol. Thank you. Others have asked, what are the challenges you've encountered in Spain when implementing these rules and regulations in view of the different settings and stakeholders involved in these rules and regulations? But I see that Pamela has turned on her camera. I don't know if she wants to make a comment before we'll move on to that question. Yes, I was trying to see how I could raise my hand. Obviously, technology is not my field of expertise. I do have a comment on the prior question that Pilar answered very clearly. I don't know if the question also refers to if, say, I am involved in the transfer of materials or data, and there is no local, national regulation or institutional regulation that governs that, what should I do to protect at the very least, even though I don't have the legal obligation to do so? I think there's always going to be some document in between a contract. So I think that by including clauses on confidentiality, legitimacy, guarantee for the person from whom the sample has been obtained, and that these guarantees are then transferred to the recipient of the materials. So even though one doesn't have the legal obligation to fulfill that framework, you are following the general guidelines to protect the rights of persons who provided their consent to participate in that research project. And that in turn would have to be transferred to the recipient. I think that by including that in the contract, even though there is no legal obligation, there's a moral obligation. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also, if you allow me to continue with your very important comment, the very important point you've made, I fully agree with Pamela, because that means if there's no legal framework, the lack of it does not mean that there's nothing on which you could base yourself. An internal policy, for instance, could obtain support of different types. For instance, there's an international declaration on bioethics and human rights and protection of genetic data. It's a UNESCO rule and regulation. So there are guidelines there on respecting the confidentiality of the subject, and they can be used as an inspiration. Also, in evaluating committees and in designing the policies of the centers, these can all be used.
Muchísimas gracias. Entonces ya me olvidé cuál era la pregunta previa.
Thank you. I forgot what the question was. Oh, that's right. It had to do with the challenges that you encountered when implementing these regulations in view of the different stakeholders that have pending tasks. I don't even know where to begin because it's been extremely complicated. And I don't want to scare you, but I could go back to 2007. Before 2007, we had no rules and regulations on the use of samples or data in research. Before that, there was no culture of asking for consent to use leftovers from a diagnosis for research purposes. There was no culture of that. And then the health professionals had no awareness of the data and samples of patients as if it was my patients, my samples, my data. And we had to change that mindset. So that was a big obstacle that existed. And then change the change of mind that had to occur. And that made it difficult to get the legislation adopted and then implemented and actually carried out. Since then, we've had to add the difference of evaluation criteria by different committees. We've set up a national committee on ethics that works. I like the term used by Carla in harmonizing, not homogenizing, because not everything has to be exactly the same, but it has to be compatible and harmonious. So we've used criteria to guide these committees, to evaluate the similar parameters. Evaluations, for instance, another problem. And then, of course, the red tape, the bureaucratic burden. All these agreements, contract, management information, consent, databases, all of that management of the quality of samples, it's very bureaucratic and it's expensive. All of this legislation, the implementation of all of this does have an economic impact. Even though you may not think that's necessary, but it's part of infrastructure. You need information. You have people who are responsible for this. And without that, it doesn't work. And again, that's another obstacle. It's something you have to keep in mind. These are the ones that just come to mind right now off the cuff, but it's a very long process. No doubt.
Yes, and in terms of what you were saying about cultural change, that is a path that we have undertaken for quite some time at PAHO. And I believe Sergio was also talking about this cultural change. And going back to what you were saying at some point in your presentation, the obligation to share for research purposes. And I think that's what this cultural change happens. That is to say, sharing benefits research and, hogging my specimens and not allowing them to be used for purposes that might benefit the population as a whole, does not help. Of course, we have to ensure certain standards, right? For us at PAHO, this has been and continues to be a learning process. I believe, just to give you an easy example, that in a lot of cases, we have realized that we are not communicating very clearly when we talk about sharing data. They can be biological material data or what have you for future research. So this is something that we include in our guidelines, especially since the Zika outbreak. However, it wasn't until last year, so over a little bit ago, that we were talking about catalyzing ethical information. That's a publication that we're working at. And that is when we realized that a lot of times we were using the same term, sharing research data, which is publishing, which is also an ethical obligation, with sharing raw data for new research. And I believe this is very correct. We have reviewed a lot of WHO and PAHO documents, and we have been using both terms indistinctively, but we need to make the difference. So I don't know if this is necessarily a cultural change, but just to ensure that every time that new policies or rules are drafted in terms of obligations to people, we should be very clear in which term we use so that we don't create confusion. Now, there's one more question that a lot of people have asked, and it has to do with that interaction between Spain and other countries. I believe that some people were posting questions, but then in your answers you provided a lot you addressed those. But basically a lot of questions are how from Spain, how do you oversee or how you vouch for a country or agency? How do you make sure that, how can you confirm that a country or an agency did their due diligence for specimen preservation? We trust the decisions, or we rely on the decisions from the ethics committees in their countries. We also review the researcher's resume, the researcher that will be in charge of the research project. You're talking about when we receive specimens in Spain, right? That is to say, how do we make sure that all the collection processes were done correctly? Okay, so in this sense, we trust, or we rely on the agency's word saying that all the rules were followed, the applicable rules for the country. We also asked about the subject consent, or whether there was some kind of exception and therefore consent was not requested. We just rely on their responses. That's all we can do. So basically, that's what we do. We also look at the researcher's reputation, the individual or the center doing research. And that's for the specimens we receive in Spain. In terms of the one we export, well, we also have to trust the receiving agencies, because you need to trust your counterpart. Otherwise, we cannot do anything. We also trust that what's been signed and agreed upon shall be done, because these are institutional agreements we're talking about. So we cannot have just the researcher's signature. We want the person responsible for the center or hospital to sign the agreement, and we trust that they will meet the commitments enshrined in the agreement. In my opinion, this is key. And I believe this is something that we don't talk about very often. Well, undoubtedly, we have made progress in terms of formalizing a lot of tasks and the clarity about your responsibility and mine. Something that now we're doing formally used to be, a gentleman's agreement. But as research becomes more rigorous, we try to identify the right tools to do certain tasks. But we have to take into account that even in the most formal scenario, with all the necessary legal document that we can think about, health-related research continues to rely vastly on trust and on understanding ethical standards of all the parties involved. Because this is a system where we have ethics standards for research, such as the SIOMS standards. We have responsible conduct guidelines, but we don't have someone looking over the shoulder to make sure that you are complying with all of the standards. So this is, again, like an honor system. It's a rigorous system, but built on trust. We are running out of time, but I would like to give the opportunity to our panelists to make some final remarks. And I would like to remind our participants that this is the first round, the first webinar of a round of 4 sessions. So with this, I mean that a lot of your questions or a lot of your concerns will be addressed as we move forward over this 4 webinar series, because we're going to go from the most general to the most specific aspects. So don't think that we are ignoring your questions, but rather that we're going to have full sessions to address a lot of the topics that you may have questions about and that we did not have time to address today. I would now like to give the floor to Sophia to see if she has any kind of final remarks, then Sergio, and then Pamela. I just wanted to say to the almost 500 people that have joined us to please encourage people from your committees to attend the 3 sessions that we have left. And also, regardless of whether or not we have rules and regulations, this is not a hindrance for each committee to have their own clear and transparent guidelines that are known to all researchers. That's all, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you very much, Sophia. Sergio, go ahead. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. This is a very complicated issue, so there are a lot of aspects to address, but I believe that this whole discussion has been extremely productive and we've learned a lot. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you to Dr. Pilar for your presentation, and thank you, Carla, for inviting me. Thank you, Pamela. Do you have any final remarks? No, just I would like to thank you for this webinar. Every day we receive more and more questions about this topic, and it is complicated. As an attorney, I am not ashamed to say that the material transfer is a complicated topic. So I believe that to researchers, when we talk about a legal agreement to do research and transfer biological material, it's very complicated. So that, and also to thank you for the opportunity of being part of this very enriching discussion and giving us the opportunity to share ideas and learn from each other. Thank you. Thank you, Pamela. Pilar, do you have any final remarks? No, I would just like to thank you for the opportunity you've given me, and I have learned a lot from you. It was great to hear from you. I have honestly loved the experience, and I certainly hope we can stay in touch. Thank you, Pilar. I believe that one of the difficulties around this topic is that it kind of forces us to bring different ways of work to the table, talking about ethics, legal issues, scientific issues. It's one of these areas that is a challenge, that, like Pamela said, but it's a challenge because we all have to be up to date and take into account other sectors' point of view, because otherwise we'll make mistakes along the way. As you know, our next session is scheduled for next Tuesday at the same time. And several of you have been asking about attendance requirements and the certificate. All of the attendees are automatically registered when you fill out the Zoom registration form. And then, using our Zoom records, we will be able to issue the attendance certificates to the people that have actually joined all 4 sessions. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate this because I posted these comments sometime along our session, but I would like to reiterate that some of you have had certain connectivity issues during the session, or some of you may have some sort of prior engagement during part of the time, but you're still interested in listening to the session, or maybe even share it with one of your colleagues or somebody else after the session ends. So, if you did not register, please go to the Regional Bioethics Program website. This is a PAHO website, and subscribe to our research ethics mailing list. We will use this mailing list to then send the recordings. And we will also be sending reminders for our upcoming sessions. And also, please take into account that you don't need to re-register for our next session. If you registered once, one registration is enough. It's the same registration that we use for all 4 sessions. I'm going to share with you the schedule. Next week, we are going to move from basic notions to practice. And we are going to have someone from NIH talking about the life of an agreement. So what the steps are and what this looks like over the course of a research study. And hopefully, as we go into further detail, we will be answering any questions that you may have. So without further ado, my colleague Sara Saracedo has shared with you the schedule for our bioethics series, and we will be waiting to hear from you, and hopefully you will subscribe, if you haven't done so, to our mailing list so you can receive invitations to other activities that we do, in terms of training opportunities, regional dialogues, additional resources, publications, and everything else that you might find interesting. Now, before concluding today's session, I would like to thank our interpreters who make it possible for our session to be available in English as well today. We've all been speaking Spanish, but this will not be the case in the upcoming sessions. And I would also like to thank our support team, which makes it possible for us to have this session, especially since there's so many of us. The PAHO's communication department has given us very important support. Silvina Acosta is behind the scenes, tying all loose ends so that everything is successful. We have support from Namsampur, Sara Saracedo, and Namsimir to do everything that we need to do in order for this session to later on be available as a recording so that you can use it for training purposes, for discussions, or to use in your ethics committee. So thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next Tuesday.